Welcome to Competitive Advantage Talks, presented by Wasserman at the 2018 MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Sam Fetter, and I'm a first-year MBA student here at MIT Sloan, and I'm proud to present our presentation, The Physiologic Doldrums, Using Lab Science and Field Analytics to Maximize Performance. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Aaron Bagish.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you. I am a clinical cardiologist. I founded and now continue to direct the Cardiovascular Performance Program, which is a program designed to take care of athletes with heart issues. We are located at Mass General and affiliated with Harvard Medical School. And I've been asked today to talk a little bit about how to integrate data that can be gathered from an exercise physiology laboratory with data that athletes generate themselves during real-world training. And if those of you in the audience are not familiar with the concept of the physiologic doldrums, it is the single most common mistake that athletes, particularly in the endurance world, make. And I will develop this concept and hopefully give you a construct to help your athletes avoid that over the course of today's talk. By way of disclosure, some affiliations, these are groups that I or my group have financial relationships with. Some of these are local teams, others are more on a national base level, and there are indeed a couple of funding sources that support our group's research work. I'll make a quick shout out to my good friend Tom Grilk sitting in the front row, Executive Director of the Boston Athletic Association. He and I work very closely on orchestrating physiology work and medical planning for their high-performance elite team here in Boston, which has been a fun enterprise. So a couple of key take-homes to start with. Athletic performance is all about leveraging basic exercise physiology principles. If you don't understand exercise physiology and you're engaging with athletes around performance, you're going to be missing the mark. These are well-established principles. They're vetted in decades worth of literature, and they can be precisely quantified. This is where data generation comes from. Importantly, though, athletes demonstrate physiologic heterogeneity, meaning all athletes are different, and each athlete needs to be defined and then subsequently redefined as individuals. This is where the value of an exercise lab is coupled with the value of understanding field-based data. Physiology without analytics and vice versa is a recipe for the physiologic doldrums. So why bother talking about this? No one in the audience needs this slide to be reminded of the fact that participation in competitive athletics, whether you're talking about young athletes at the high school or college level, or older athletes who participate in organized road races, triathlons, or perhaps prefer gym-based fitness, these populations are on the rise, and we're not seeing any plateau. So the number of people that push their bodies hard and want data to improve performance continues to mount. In the business world, and I guarantee you every single one of you in the audience knows more about the business world than I do as a doctor, you understand the importance of market research. Well, as medical professionals, we understand market research too. We just label it something different. We call it population epidemiology. And this is an example of our market research as sports cardiologists. This was a study that was performed by one of my postdocs, Kaylee Shapiro, looking at masters athletes within the greater Boston area. So these are men and women above the age of 40, and we simply wanted to understand who these people were from the perspective of health, wellness, and performance. Now, these people were recruited not because they have heart problems, but simply because they belong to one of the local running clubs, cycling clubs, triathlon clubs, and were out there getting after it on a routine basis. And what we found were some interesting things. First and foremost, these ostensibly healthy men and women, these are the folks running up and down the Charles River, rowing in the head of the Charles, had undergone a lot of heart testing. And they had done so for a very specific reason. And that is that their doctors identified that many of these very, again, ostensibly healthy people have risk factors for heart disease. So either a family history of heart disease, prior tobacco use, high blood pressure, problems with cholesterol. And in fact, again, in this healthy aging population, only 1/4 of these people were risk factor free. So their doctors were identifying that even though they were athletic, there were potential problems, and they were testing them. But the single most important thing that we learned from this study is that 40% of these men and women above the age of 40 who were athletic felt dissatisfied with their interaction with their doctors because they felt dismissed or mistreated due to their status as an athlete. The consistent story was, walked in, had a complaint, doctor looked at me and said, if you're running 5 miles, you can't have a problem, I'll see the next patient. So this is a big issue. We've known this for a long time, and this is very much the backbone of the Cardiovascular Performance Program, which I run. Our mission statement is quite simple, and that is to provide comprehensive world-class clinical care and research focusing on disease prevention, management, and performance enhancement for athletes and highly active individuals. There are 4 pillars of what we do. We provide have pre-participation screening for a number of groups to ferret out heart disease before athletes get into trouble. We spend most of our time with a busy consult and longitudinal care service in which we take care of athletes starting at the puberty years all the way up until folks in their 80s and 90s, helping them understand where their cardiovascular risk lies and how we can better manage that and keep them athletic. And an important part of what we do is performance enhancement in healthy people, and this is an optimization service, and that's what I'm going to spend the most of my time talking about today. To work in a place like MGH and Harvard Medical School, this program has to have a clinical care mission, which is, again, to enhance our institutional mission, patient care, community service, but also science. And so a lot of our science focuses on how we can understand health in athletes across the age spectrum and how we can apply performance physiology to make healthy people better. So when we started our program back in 2007, this is what the sports cardiology map looked like in the United States. Last I tallied at the end of 2017, these are the resources around the country. So what we've done, the program we've developed, the template for caring for athletes, is one that has been adopted by essentially every major tertiary or quaternary care center within the US, which is an exciting indication of the fact that communities see value in this. So one of the things we spend a lot of time doing is basic physiology testing. And when you bring an athlete into the exercise lab, you can measure hundreds of things: peak oxygen consumption, power, peak heart rate, submaximal thresholds, work efficiency, metabolic rate. And we typically do so for one of four reasons. First and second are to assess functional capacity and to track response to training. We also do a lot of work designing injury recovery protocols and are increasingly being asked to tailor nutrition and hydration strategies for athletes that have different goals and different physiologic limitations. What I'd like to do is share with you one case in which I will attempt to explain a paradigm for bridging what we do in a laboratory versus what an athlete does out in the real world, and how bringing those two together ultimately is the single best way to optimize performance. So I want to tell you about MK. And this is just one of many examples with the same take-home. MK is a 26-year-old elite level rower who comes to us seeking input because he had developed a performance plateau. Basically, he attended a top university program, one of the top 5 rowing schools in the country, spent 3 to 4 years with the US national team, and during that period of time really had marginal improvement and got very frustrated. He decided to take a break from US rowing. It was kind of a shared decision between he and his coaches, but he had decided he was not ready to quit. So he came to us asking for some advice, and this is the paradigm that we approach to the management of suboptimal performance. The first starts with a medical evaluation. I'll say a bit about that in a second. The second step in the sequence is physiology evaluation. The third step is training evaluation. And then bringing that together, there's a planning, reassessment, and implementation phase where, again, there's a synthesis of lab and field data. So in MK's situation, a multi-system medical assessment, including cardiovascular assessment, blood work, everything we would do to ferret out subclinical disease in an otherwise healthy person, was really unrevealing. And this is good because this means this is not a health problem per se, but something about the way the athlete's training and trying to engage their body from a physiologic perspective. I will say, and there's some selection bias in this, that about 50% of the elite level athletes that come to us with a performance decrement have some undetected medical issue that explains it. So while I'm going to talk about optimizing performance in a healthy athlete, those of you that work with athletes that are experiencing plateaus in their training, do not forget that medical issues, even very subtle ones, can be a good explanation for that. That was not MK's situation. He was actually quite healthy and had no issues. So the next step in his evaluation was physiology. So to talk about what we do in a physiologic assessment, I want to just take a brief digression and go through a couple of principles around how we think about physiology from this perspective of health and performance. So this is the so-called Wasserman diagram. It's a very famous diagram in human physiology. And the diagram basically depicts the flow of oxygen into the body, first within the lungs, then moving through the circulatory system, being pumped by the heart and transported by the arteries, and ultimately ending up in the muscle where oxygen combines with some usable fuel substrate to generate power. The byproduct of that reaction, which is carbon dioxide, is then shuttled in the exact opposite direction, requiring efflux from the muscles, transportation through the cardiovascular system, and eventually being breathed out in the lungs. And what you can really take from this is that in order for an athlete to optimally utilize oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide, everything in these 3 cogs of the chain, so the lungs, the heart and circulatory system, and the muscle, has to be working optimally. These are all in some way, shape, or form trainable too. So when we think in the latter part of the talk about a response to a training program, I'm going to ask you to think about which of these systems may have been responsible for an athlete's ability to improve performance. And I'll give you a little hint, it's not the lungs. So when we take an athlete into the exercise lab, as I said, there's lots we can measure, but there are really three fundamental relationships which are all you kind of need to know. The first is the heart rate work relationship. On the first graph you see on your right, you'll see heart rate plotted against work in watts, and watts can be measured on a bike precisely, but can also be generated by a conversion estimation from time on a treadmill or time on a rowing ergometer. But the basic take home is that there's a direct linear relationship between heart rate and work. The harder you work, the higher your heart rate. Pretty simple. The same actually holds true for oxygen consumption. And you can see that in a healthy person, VO2, the amount of oxygen that you're taking in any given moment, is directly and linearly related to work. So heart rate, VO2, work, all linear relationships. It gets a tad bit more complicated when we introduce carbon dioxide into the equation. And what you can see here in the third graph, red dots representing oxygen, blue dots representing carbon dioxide. They are superimposable up into a certain point, somewhere in the moderate range of exercise, after which carbon dioxide becomes steeper. That's indicating a higher efflux of carbon dioxide relative to oxygen uptake. And this is called the ventilatory threshold. The ventilatory threshold is the single most important measurement we make on elite level athletes, and it is that measurement which helps us take people over the plateau time and time again. So what is that really measuring? It's measuring the difference between buffered exercise and non-buffered exercise. All of you buy your commercial heart rate monitor, you pull it out of the box, and it's got 8 different zones that are all nicely color-coded. There's some value to multiple zones, but from the perspective of human physiology, there are only 2 zones, above and below your ventilatory threshold. Below the ventilatory threshold, any work is indefinitely sustainable, meaning with proper hydration and nutrition, an athlete can continue with that workload for however many hours they choose to do so. Above the ventilatory threshold work, effort-dependent terminal fatigue sets in, meaning at some point the athlete will succumb to fatigue. No matter what they do around hydration, nutrition, mental training, you simply can't operate at that level indefinitely. So this is key, and this is, many of you will be thinking about lactate threshold, which is closely related but a slightly different measurement. But just remember, 2 zones, above and below ventilatory threshold. Basic outcome measurements we care about are measured heart rate max. Anyone that thinks that an equation can be used to predict maximal heart rate is kidding themselves. So when you try to think about 220 minus your age or 220 minus your age times 0.5, it's all garbage. The standard deviations on true physiologic heart rate are on the order of 15 to 20 beats per minute. So if you're working with an athlete or you're an athlete yourself and you're using heart rate to guide your workouts and you're using a percentage of peak, if you're not measuring it, you're almost certainly making an error. So we measure this, and this is required for the zoning, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Second thing we do is look at aerobic efficiency, which is the slope of the oxygen work relationship. And this is a useful guide to give athletes an idea of how hard they should push during various competitions. And then again, this measurement of the ventilatory threshold, which I'll return to. So let's look at MK's physiology performance. He has a measured heart rate max of 208 beats per minute. Again, if we use 220 minus his age, we'd be somewhere down around the low 190s. And so if you're gauging heart rate as a function of predicted max, you have to measure it. He had a peak VO2 of 71 mils per kilogram, which squarely places him in the elite level. This is the exact type of VO2 we would expect to see in a US national team caliber rower. And he had a ventilatory threshold heart rate that occurred at 78% of VO2 max at a heart rate of about 162. So this was our starting point for this young man. Again, he comes to us asking, how can I get better? And this is how we define him on day 1. The next thing, and this is probably the most important thing and requires the least science, is to look at his training. So one of the things we tell everyone that comes to see us is this is not a one-stop shop. This is an iterative process, and you're going to do more of the work than we do. And the first thing you're going to do is go out and do 90 days of just what you were doing before you came to see us. Don't change a thing, but just track it. We want you to define each workout. We want you to wear a heart rate monitor and measure heart rate kinetics during each workout. And we want you to rate each workout subjectively. How do we want them to do that? We want them to tell us on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfying was that workout? Now you may say, what does satisfaction matter? Well, it actually matters quite a bit, and I'll explain why in a second. We try to keep this very, very simple for the athlete. Score of 1 to 10, how satisfying was the workout? So MK's comes back 90 days later, and this is what he tells us. He's training 13 sessions a week, approximately 18 hours. 11 of these are what he would define as base building workouts. 2 are higher intensity. His heart rate kinetics look something like this. For his base building workouts, he's at a heart rate of 160 plus minus 2 beats per minute. That's a very, very, very small measure of error, meaning he's doing the same thing every day, all the time for these workouts. His high intensity workouts are only 12 beats per minute higher, again, with a very, very small standard deviation. He's got resting heart rate values of about 52 in the morning. And interestingly, subjectively, he really likes those base building workouts. He likes the 11 times a week that he goes out and just tries to maintain his fitness. He's not real satisfied with the high intensity stuff. He can't really explain why. And interestingly, he only feels recovered 50% of the time. So what's the plan? What do we do with this young man? Well, the first thing is to go back and think about each of these things and make some assessments about where the problems might be. Now, from a volume perspective, 18 hours of endurance training is fairly typical for an elite level endurance athlete, so the volume is probably appropriate. The issue that we learned from the heart rate kinetics, and again, this is field data, this is not lab data, this is field data, is that we've got some real relative intensity problems, and I'll explain that in a second. And what's most interesting is when you look at his subjective reporting, the easy's too satisfying, the hard's not satisfying enough, and he's only feeling recovered 50% of the time. So we have a good starting point to work with. So let's integrate this back with what we know about him from the perspective of his physiology. Again, a peak heart rate of 208, peak VO2 is 71, ventilatory threshold heart rate of 162 beats per minute, and we have these field kinetics. We know that during his base building workouts, he's at 180, his high intensity intervals, he's at 172, and he's got this resting heart rate of 52 with this subjective reporting, which I've already gone through. So what does this look like when we start stacking things up? Well, first, again, here he is at peak, 208, 71 mils per kg. Here he is at his ventilatory threshold, 162 beats per minute, and here are his workouts superimposed. So his base building workouts are essentially superimposed right on his ventilatory threshold, meaning he's working about as hard as he possibly can and maintain that effort indefinitely, and he's doing that because he's not being coached to do anything differently, and this is what feels natural as an athlete, to push to this level and sustain it for that period of time and to just consider it a good maintenance workout. Interestingly, his high-intensity intervals, which we really care about in terms of building performance capacity, are only slightly above that. He's not able to get much of a high-intensity spike because he's not recovering well enough on his base-building days. So how do we take this information and then turn it into a plan? So there are basically 4 steps. 1 is to individualize his physiology. 2 is to generate a calendar assessment plan. 3 is to assess his support structure. And then 4th and most important is to turn this into a longitudinal program in which he's able to be reassessed, both with his coach's input and the rowing team's input, but also with our input so we can affirm that what he's doing is making sense. So first part of individualizing physiology is to avoid the doldrums and to work out purposely and above and below this area. So the physiologic doldrums look something like this. It is an exercise intensity that is roughly 5 beats above and 5 beats below your ventilatory threshold. Nothing to be gained here on day-to-day training. The vast majority of athletes that are left to their own devices, endurance athletes left to their own devices, will do this over and over and over again, and they will fail to reach their performance potential. So the first thing we do is have them understand that in this heart rate zone, there's nothing to be gained on a day-to-day basis from training there. But what is to be gained are very purposeful sub-doldrum workouts, and these are, again, well below this ventilatory threshold, and there are 3 basic types. We do aerobic base building workouts, technique work, and active recovery sessions, and these are scattered around the weekly calendar in very purposeful ways. And if an athlete's able to stay in this subdoldrum area, then they're really able to maximize the supradoldrum workouts, which is where the performance gain comes. And there are various types of supradoldrum workouts. Many of these terms will be familiar to you folks. Steady state sessions, short duration, long duration intervals. These are really tailored to what the goals of the athlete are. And we assess these goals by starting with a calendar assessment. So the very first thing we do with everyone that comes to us is ask them to define their ultimate goal event. In MK's situation, it was to make the U.S. Olympic team heading to Rio. And so we had a very clear time plan over the course of an 18-month period to work to get there. Periodized training. Once that ultimate goal is set, the calendar is backfilled in a periodized way, which allows blocks of training with specific goals, and we can get into those more in detail if people are interested. Within this periodized calendar, there need to be scheduled race simulations and ultimately build up competitions that approximate the event that the athlete cares about most. Support structure is key, and I just want to say a word about coaching. As a medical professional that works with lots and lots of elite athletes, I spend lots of time talking to my athletes about their coaches. And what I found routinely is that coaches that understand and apply physiology win. Coaches that forget physiology lose. So one of the very common conversations I'll have with my athlete is, how is your coach integrating physiology concept into your training? And if they look at me with a blank face, I don't necessarily suggest they find a new coach, but it's at least pause for concern. Nutrition, parental support, these are all part of the dialogue. And once this is laid out, the key is to have a reassessment plan. And in MK's situation, we decided it made sense for him to return to the exercise physiology lab every 4 months for reassessment. So again, what did our program do for this young man? Here are his baseline values. I've showed you all of this. And on his third reassessment, which happened to be, I think, 11 months later, this is where he ends up. So what's interesting is that he's actually decreased the amount of training he's doing, fewer sessions per week, fewer hours. His physiology data from the lab is actually quite impressive. His peak heart rate doesn't change. His peak VO2 only goes up a little bit. But his heart rate at the ventilatory threshold goes from 162 to 176. Now remember, I told you the heart rate work relationship is inviolate. So if you're able to bump that ventilatory threshold heart rate up by 10 or 15%, which he did, the effort at which you can sustain a pace indefinitely during a race goes up proportionally. So this is the single best metric we have for gauging physiologic response to training. His heart rate kinetics, now out in the field after we've kind of put him into the supra and the infra doldrum ranges, have also mirrored that. His base building heart rates are in the 150s, his high intensity interval heart rates are up close to 180, and interestingly, his resting heart rate has come down nicely, which is again another pretty robust marker of physiologic adaptation. Subjectively, interestingly, he doesn't like those base building workouts quite as much because he's forced to go a little easier and he wants to push hard, but he's finding a lot more bang for his buck during the high intensity interval workouts, and he's gone from a 50% to a 70% recovery rate, which is actually a great indication of success. So he did end up going on to row in the Rio Olympics in the 8 boat and had a great showing, and this was a very successful thing for him and for our program. Going back to the initial key messages, athletic performance, again, is about leveraging basic physiology principles. When you're thinking about performance in any given athlete, it's a function of heart, lung, muscle, and brain function, and any one of those systems can contribute to suboptimal physiology and suboptimal performance. These principles are very clear, and I've walked you through them. What we care about most when we're measuring athletes in the lab is maximal heart rate and its relationship with work, VO2 and its relationship with work, and then this magic ventilatory threshold. Athletes are individuals, again, and if you think that you can use predictive algorithms at the elite level to understand how to design training zones or how to prescribe exercise training regimens, you're probably kidding yourself. It's really all about integrating what happens in the lab with what the athlete reports in the field, and it's uniting this information that optimizes performance. And again, the physiology without the analytics or vice versa is a recipe for the physiologic doldrums. So without that, I will conclude, and I appreciate your attention. Happy to take any questions.
If you have any questions, please raise your hand. We will bring a microphone to you.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, I love it. So the question was, what about heart rate variability? So most of you are familiar with the recent marketing surge around heart rate variability as a predictor of recovery. In the medical literature, heart rate variability has been around for several decades. It was first described as a predictor of who was at increased risk for dying after a heart attack. And it is, if done correctly, a reasonably good way at looking at the balance between the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, with the idea that the improperly recovered athlete will have sympathetic predominance. And in theory, it's a great technology. The problem is that you could generate a list of 100 variables that affects heart rate variability, probably more than recovery. So while I'm not a disbeliever, I have yet to see it used very effectively in elite level performers independently. Now, if it's used as a backup tool to back up their subjective sensation around recovery, I have no problem with it, but it's really quite a fickle physiology. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
When you look at the case study, what do you find is the most important? Is it drop volume, you drop intensity, you increase intensity? If you just increase intensity and drop volume, would the person have the same?
Yeah, I would argue that the volume, although there was a slight reduction, is not the issue. The issue is that he now has two very, very purposeful and very, very different forms of workouts, with the lower intensity workouts being far away from the high intensity workouts. So he's basically diverged his physiology into two very different types of days. And that lower intensity preponderance allows for appropriate recovery, such that the higher intensity days can really be much more of a gain for the athlete.
So I think in a periodized programming, like that's just a snippet, right?
Yep.
But if they're doing a long duration exercise, they're at their
No. In fact, that's the whole purpose of this paradigm, is to keep them away from that.
No, in a race. Like
in a race.
Competition. So if they're periodized, then you're trying to get them towards competition.
Yeah.
So obviously you're going to have that as part of the training at some point. So the training that's adapted here is, again, a snippet of a periodized program.
Oh, no question. So, and those are average values that I showed you. So those are average values over the course of an 11th month period. So within that 179 heart rate, the high intensity, there was a standard deviation of 10 beats per minute or 8 beats per minute. That meant that we were using different workouts at high intensity levels to approximate different race conditions to get the athlete ready for that. But more importantly than the high intensity stuff is backing off and allowing the low intensity stuff to really be low. The vast majority of athletes we work with get better when they recover from injury, because for the first time in their lives they've been forced to take breaks, and they have to build up slowly, and they realize they've come back stronger than ever. Resting is really hard for athletes. Anything else? Yes, sir?
I'm familiar with a piece of technology that measures power output, contribute more, and exit. Are you familiar with any research looking at overlaying the physiologic data with power output?
Well, I mean, most people that use power output, and we'll take the paradigm of the cyclist, because the cyclists tend to love their power output meters more than anyone, they will typically couple it with a heart rate. And in that situation, the single best indicator of a fitness improvement is a change in the heart rate power relationship. So if your power goes up at any given heart rate, that's an indication of training adaptation. And indeed, we superimpose power, heart rate, and VO2 on that ventilatory threshold graph all the time to give power-based athletes an idea of how to prescribe power for different workouts. Yes, sir?
So I spend a lot of time thinking about more anaerobic exercise optimization, and I was curious if there's something similar to the ventilatory threshold for more of an anaerobic activity like weightlifting, or I spend a lot of time thinking about fishing.
Yes, so in the lab there are surrogate tests that look at anaerobic power that we use. Probably the most common one, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is a Wingate test. The trouble is that it activates such a different set of physiologic machines than an aerobic workout that the lab probably has a more limited value there. And what I think you're probably used to doing is actually using the exercises that you care about as the gold standard benchmarks for deltas. So I think the lab is better suited for team athletes in which there's an endurance component, or true endurance athletes. All right, I think I'll be cut off from the back. Thank you so much for your attention.